Hello, and welcome to Check It Out with EVPL. I'm your host, Lori, and I'm joined today with
Jamie
and
Rachel.
So, Rachel, you're new. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I am a facilitator who works in the Popular Materials Center here at Central, and I primarily work with our teens, especially from like Signature School and other groups that come in.
Okay, so since you work with teens, you work with the demographic that is primarily most affected by banned books. Is that correct?
Yes, I've definitely had conversations with a lot of them about it because they see it in the news and they've had, they hear about their favorite books being banned and things like that. And a lot of them kind of worry about the day that it might come to affect them and their favorite books. But I think a lot of the teens I talk to are also very privileged to have parents and things that are very encouraging of them reading whatever they want and kind of exploring different topics and things like that.
That's good to hear. I know when I was growing up, the way that my family handled it was I could read mostly whatever I wanted, but just if I didn't understand something, I had to have a conversation with my parents as to what this was and, whether or not it was actually age appropriate for me. Because my parents did have some oversight, but they were big believers of read what you feel you're comfortable for.
Yeah, my parents definitely were very much they're very big readers, both of them. So they wanted me to kind of explore and expand on my own and things like that. But I do specifically remember being in elementary school and being very determined to read Firestarter by Stephen King. And my mom being like, maybe with this one, we're going to have some boundaries here. And but she still let me read it, but she blacked out a bunch of things. She went through and read it and made sure that she was like, maybe not this part.
We had one similar with that, and that was Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. In retrospect, I get it, Mom.
Yeah.
So this is a good segue, though. Today's episode is about banned books, because Banned Books Weeks is coming up soon, September 18th through 24th, 2022. So we are going to just talk about banned books today. So with banned books, what is your personal favorite book that is or has been challenged or banned?
I've made a point of reading banned books on a regular basis. The first one that comes to mind, though, I don't know that I could identify a favorite because several of them are very meaningful, but the first one that comes to mind is Animal Farm. It's probably the first book that I read that was a banned book. I read it in middle school, and I wasn't even aware that banning books was a thing at that age, but I remember it really just giving me new insights about how to view the world. Mm-hmm. And I liked the way they took a controversial topic and different points of view and shifted it a little bit to use animal characters so that they could kind of come at this topic obliquely.
Yeah, it's not as a personal confrontation.
Exactly. Which allowed people who might really struggle with confronting those issues head on, be able to sit with them and read and kind of process it in a different way.
Yeah, because it's not as personal.
Exactly. Yeah. And, but there's a number of books that would fall into that category of course, there's Fahrenheit 451. That's an obvious one. The Handmaid's Tale was a book I've read many years ago. And, growing up, I just was pretty much allowed to read whatever I came to read. And it was a ridiculously long amount of time before I realized that were people that were actively trying to prevent people from reading things.
I'm a little envious. I do notice there is overarching theme in those books that you mentioned about dystopians, essentially, which I knew a lot of banned books were dystopic. I knew a lot of banned books were dystopian. And it's funny because you mentioned Animal Farm. I was going to mention almost the opposite spectrum of Animal Farm, which is Brave New World by Huxley. Well, love that book. And it is similar themes, but rather than being constrained, it is the semblance or the image of freedom, even though you're constrained. Whereas Animal Farm, 1984.
Right. Especially 1984. The end of that book really hit me hard because of, and I don't know if I should give any spoilers away.
The book is 6 years
It's been out there. All right.
But every time I read this, reread that book, I get anxious, knowing the ending is coming because I'm I remember where we're going and I don't. It gives me feelings.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the very thought that this guy who realized the wrongness in the propaganda and the coercion of thought was going on, that eventually it worked. And in the end, he loved Big Brother. And that final line, I can't read it without feeling a knife in my heart every single time.
What about you, Rachel?
Okay, so as much as I love these like more classic examples, and dystopias have been like a huge part of my life, I love those stories. But some of my favorite banned books, like Jamie, I like to read specifically banned books, and like it's something I've sought out a lot of my life because I'm a very, very curious person, and if you tell me I don't need to know something, I want to know it.
Exactly.
So I did a lot of that, and then I remember I was writing a paper in high school about book banning, and I found out about the book And Tango Makes Three, which is a picture book about two male penguins who raise a baby together, and I think was kind of the first time I saw book banning outside of the lens of more like classic like books that you sort of think of, and I think that really opened my eyes a lot to the scope of it, which is really interesting because like we talked about earlier, it affects children's books, especially like teen books, a lot more. And now like one of my more recent favorites is Heartstopper, and I know it's like gained incredible popularity, but it has already been facing challenges partially due to its visibility of it being an LGBTQ storyline, and a lot of people of course don't like that. And that's one that I know somebody personally who had like a teacher at a school checked it out from the school library and like actually ruined the pages of the book to get it taken from the library, and then ended up getting it removed off the school shelves like permanently.
That's disappointing.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, so very much close to home because I love that story so much.
Well, speaking of kids' books, the one that always sticks out to me is, because it's ironically funny more than anything, the children's book Brown Bear, What Do You See? By Bill Martin Jr., mostly known by Eric Carle, though, was banned in 2010 because somebody mistook Bill Martin for a different Bill Martin and said he was a communist. So therefore the book was banned by the State Board of Education of Texas.
This is why we double check our sources, friends.
Yes. Double checking is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Another special mention, going back to the classics, though, is one of my favorites, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. And I actually read that in high school. Most of the books I am realizing that I have read that were banned at one point were because of one specific teacher, now that I think about it. And I should reach out to her and thank her, because those are all books I still love to this day.
Yes. Well, I saw a statement once, and I feel like this is really accurate. And it said, banning a book is like wrapping it in bacon and deep frying it.
Just going to make it more delicious.
Well, right. It's the thing that makes people go, ooh, what's that about? You know, and I've worked in bookstores and I've worked at the library. And one thing I've noted is anytime a book comes along that's really actively being banned or challenged, book sales go through the roof.
Oh, yeah. Mouse, just, what was it, a year or so ago?
Yes.
The hold list for Mouse was miles long.
Yeah.
Right. And I was at that time also working at a bookstore, and we couldn't keep it in stock.
Yeah, Amazon couldn't keep it in stock either.
Yes. I was actually just reading about that. So Mouse is a book. It's a nonfiction book, but written as a graphic novel after the author, Art Spiegelman, interviewed his father about his experience as a Polish Jew under the Nazis. And so, not unlike Animal Farm, they recreated using animals as rather than humans for characters, but still with the realistic experiences. And it was the very first graphic novel that won a Pulitzer Prize. And yet, because it dealt with those painful, difficult, challenging topics, people wanted to remove it. In fact, one statement that was made about that was they wanted to, why can't they teach a nicer Holocaust?
How do you teach a nice Holocaust?
Precisely. And the whole point is some topics are just going to be painful to discuss, but it's the essential part of not repeating the mistakes of history.
Yeah, I do think, this is just my personal opinion, that a lot of times books are challenged or banned because it makes the person that is doing the challenging or banning uncomfortable in a way that they don't want to have a conversation about.
Right.
They don't want to have a conversation about the fact that millions of people died, or that maybe they aren't as open and accepting as they think they are. And so rather than accepting these things about themselves, because we're all problematic and we all have issues.
Yes.
They would rather just make sure nobody speaks about it.
Right. It's a thing we don't talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that lack of conversation is really a big part of it. I know that even in library circles, we talk about intellectual freedom and wanting to like show all points of view and things, but there's still conversations of, okay, but what do we want on the shelves? And a lot of that, I think, comes down to whether or not we are willing to have those conversations. Because, a lot of things are from the past are ugly and we don't necessarily want to talk about them, but in a lot of ways, that's why we should.
Yes.
Forgetting these things is not going to help. I think it kind of goes back to 1984 in a way, and how they would kind of manipulate the memories of the population. And
they would gaslight an entire population.
Which that actually brings me to a point of, I had done some research on book burning, or book banning, excuse me. Book burning comes into play too.
It overlaps.
Yeah. Throughout history, because I'm the history person and I like that. So the first instance we actually have of book banning was around 259 to 210 BC. A Chinese emperor, I apologize for this pronunciation, named Shi Huangti, is said to have buried alive 460 Confucian scholars because he wanted to control history. So in 2012, he burned all the books in the kingdom. He kept one copy for his royal library, and when he died, he had that destroyed with him.
Wow.
So that he could write history from the beginning with him as the first king or emperor.
Wow. People want to control the narrative.
Yeah.
And they want to control it in the way that makes them look best, but also reinforces their own point of view.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I feel like it tends to be people that are very pro-book banning, have a specific viewpoint that they think is inherently correct and cannot be questioned. And that if you are to question it, you are questioning them as an individual and not their beliefs.
Yes, agreed. And the way I look at reading difficult things, and there are definitely things that I would find it difficult to read, that would stress me and frustrate me. But the thing is, if I'm not able to re-examine my own thoughts on a subject and either have them challenged or confirmed, depending on how honest I'm willing to be, I'm not willing to grow.
Yeah. I am actually reading a book right now, not been banned or challenged that I know of, by Dave Cullen, Columbine. I'm reading that because Columbine was the first major news story that I remember happening as a kid. And Dylan Klebold's mother recently put out a book. I wanted to read that, so I wanted to have all the information before I went into it. That book is hard to read.
Yes.
There are times I have to just stop and cry for a little bit.
Yes.
But reading those tough topics and those difficult conversations are so important to make sure that this kind of stuff is well known and talked about so it doesn't just continuously keep happening.
Right. Well, putting yourself in someone else's shoes by reading books presented from their own perspective doesn't mean you're going to end up agreeing with that perspective, but it will give you insight into the things that formed that perspective and help you, at the very minimum, understand a little bit better, even if you don't agree. I've had conversations with people who wanted to sway me to a specific point of view, and they would say to me, I'm not explaining this very well. And I would very gently and very respectfully say, no, I do understand where you're coming from. I do. I just don't agree with you. And I feel like that's possible. And those conversations can happen and are good for us.
So the next historical book banning that I found is actually kind of backing up what you were saying. So around 640 BC, according to a legend, so we don't have any proof of this, again, the same with the Shi Huangti emperor, is that there was a caliph named Omar who burned all 200,000 volumes in the Alexandrian library in Egypt. He said that if the writings of the Greeks agreed with the Book of God, they're useless, and if they disagree, they ought to be destroyed. So that religious element is coming into play very early on. And he burned so many books, he provided 6 months worth of fuel to warm the city's bath.
I mean, I've read that meme you know you're a book nerd when you're really still upset about the burning of Alexandria. And I'm still very upset about it.
Well, and this isn't even that burning. The Library of Alexandria was burnt multiple times.
Jeez. So much more than I was aware. I, of course, knew of the major historical event. But I guess that was just, the others were the precursors to the final ending.
Yep. And then continuing with the religious element in the late 1400s, so 15th century, if you watch The Borgias, you'll be familiar with this character. There is a man named Savonarola, a Florentine religious fanatic, and he was known for burning things, not just books, but he was known for taking items of vice out of people's houses and burning it. And paintings of some of the greatest artists of Florence. He's the one that created what we call now the bonfire of the vanities. So he would persuade artists to bring their own art to burn. He would have all these books that people burned. Popular songs were no longer allowed to be sang and had to be replaced instead with pious lyrical hymns. And at the end of it, in May of 1498, one more great bonfire was lit where they burned Savonarola.
Wow.
They burned all his writings, sermons, essays, and pamphlets.
So he started it, and then it swept him up.
Yeah, he was finished by his own hand, basically.
Wow. But, I mean, I totally see that. I do.
Which,
this start a spark, and we think we're going to control what comes next.
Yeah. Well, and especially with this one, I do know a little bit more information about it because I am a fan of that time period. There were so many political aspects that he was going directly against the Pope at the time. No matter what time period you're from, who thinks they're going to go out against the Pope and win?
Right.
That was interesting. In the early 1500s, William Tinsdale's English translation of the New Testament was printed in Germany and smuggled into England, where they were publicly burned by the London's Roman Catholic bishops' orders.
Because the holy word shouldn't be translated into a common language.
Yes, they thought it was only be in Latin.
Yes.
Which also creates an education barrier, because if you have average people that can't understand it, then they can never hold any positions of power where they would have to speak on that
and they can
subject.
never challenge what they're taught. If they can't read themselves, then what is being taught to them, it could be anything.
Yeah.
And if they can't read the words themselves, then they can never go, wait a minute, that's not what it said.
It's almost the opposite side of the coin to the religious aspects we were talking about earlier, where he was trying to bring this religious information to the masses and was punished for that, even though he was trying to spread information rather than limit it. I think this is the first time that we see that kind of banning. Apparently now today only 3 original copies of that translated New Testament even exist.
Wow. Yeah, I think you made a good point, though, about not being able to read something for yourself to know if what you're being told about it is true. And that's another just aspect of book banning in general, not even just in the language barrier of it, of, you know, people saying this book is bad for X, Y, or Z reason, and then taking it away, though, so you can't check for yourself and see what those words actually say.
Sure. I mean, it's very reminiscent of 1984. If the state tells you to believe something and you have nothing to disagree with it, how else are you going to not believe that?
This podcast is really just a 1984 fan club.
You're not wrong.
Well, you know, I'm going to go here and say there was a point in my life when I was into a situation where there was a lot of effort at controlling what was read, what was thought, what was spoken, what TV shows were watched, what movies were gone to. And I always resisted that anyway. Just that's my nature. But I would remember hearing book reviews put out by the people that wanted to have those controls in place. And they'd go, don't read this book for this reason. And don't read this book for this reason. And I would always go, why do you get to read it? And tell me why I can't. Why can't I read it for myself and decide?
Yeah, it's the same idea of your parents saying, because I said so.
Yes. Yeah. And I always resisted that and resented that. It's why Banned Books Week is such a personally important holiday to me, because it's that intellectual freedom, that decision of I will take in the information. I will process the information. I will ask questions. I will challenge. I will agree. I will disagree, but I will decide.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope I always decide based on good, solid evidence and information, not just because this is what I like, but I deserve the ability, the chance, the opportunity. I deserve the opportunity to decide for myself.
Yeah, I think everybody does.
Exactly. And that is the whole point.
So there were quite a few book bannings throughout history that were led by religious institutions. I think the most prominent one, at least in Western society, is probably going to be in 1559, where the Roman Catholic Church listed books that were prohibited to its members. But in this year, the Pope Paul IV established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and that was a book list that I don't know how long it went on, but it went on for hundreds of years where they would just add and retract books as they felt like to basically say no Catholics could read these books. So that is probably the most overarching example that of book banning I've seen. So I do want to let listeners know that it does seem like maybe we're going fairly hard on the religious aspect of book banning right now. But the context of that is that in this time period, religious texts were almost the only thing that were available to the average people, or the average person. And they were the most commonly printed and created books. So at that time period, the sample size is pretty much going to be strictly religious because that is the only thing that was really produced.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Because the truth is, any ideology, whether religious or otherwise, can have its extremist elements that try to control what people think or act or read.
Sure. And there were examples of censorship before these book bannings that would be somewhat, you could make the argument related. For example, philosophers in ancient Greek.
Right.
People would disagree with what they were saying. So the next thing you know, they are banished for the year.
Right.
That's the same thing. The only thing is they didn't write it on paper or stone or tablet.
Right.
Moving away from the religious part, though, well, kind of. One more religious one. So I think the example that most people think of, though, when they think of censorship and book banning, at least the way that I was taught about it, is Galileo.
Right.
Trying to teach a heliocentric model of the universe, and the Catholic Church saying, absolutely not. Earth has to be the center of the universe because that's what our teachings teach. At the age of 70, he was sentenced to jail, and he had to renounce what he knew. And when he died, his widow agreed to destroy some of his manuscripts.
So did she?
We have no proof. I don't know enough, honestly.
Okay. All right. Okay. I was wondering if you were going to drop that.
I
but
wish.
She didn't, or something.
How cool would that be to be like on this random public library podcast? Let me drop some historical game changers.
That would be amazing.
The next big one I think that I can see is probably Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. And it was actually banned from multiple countries, specifically Yugoslavia and Greece. Ernest Hemingway's books were banned by Nazis and burned by them.
See, there's some things in which to be proud of, and that is definitely one. I would be very proud if Nazis were burning my books.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Badge of honor.
Which, speaking of Nazis, 1933, massive bonfires in Nazi Germany.
Right.
Burned books written by Jewish people, communists, Albert Einstein, Freud, Hemingway, Helen Keller, Jack London. I don't understand why Jack London. Maybe I just don't know enough about him. Karl Marx, pretty much anybody.
Yeah. Right. I feel like that when people think of banning or burning books, that is the picture that comes to mind. I mean, to go current movies, well, not super current, but that Indiana Jones movie where he's trying to get that secret journal and he's going through Germany and they're showing those piles and piles of books being burned.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I feel like for modern people, that is the singular image that we get when we think of that sort of thing.
I wonder if that's shifting a little bit just with how much book bans have been in the news. So I wonder if kind of the scope with which people understand book banning is expanding at all,
That's
just from how
true.
much the conversation has been going on the past few months or year.
That's probably true.
I think it's been going on longer than that because obviously I've got all this history stuff in front of me, but just in my own personal life, I remember Harry Potter books being burned.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just random groups of people banning and burning Harry Potter books for being satanic.
Right.
Yeah.
Which also Solomon Rushdie in 1989 wrote the Satanic Verses, and that book was banned. Not only banned, he had like a fatwa placed against him.
Yes, yes. And that's kind of where I want to step in, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Is as I was preparing for this podcast, of course, that attack against Salman Rushdie in New York City happened just, 2 weeks ago?
Mm-hmm.
And where the stage was rushed while he was preparing to give a lecture, and he was stabbed 11 times.
Yeah.
And he is recovering. I tried to do a little bit of what's his condition now, kind of research, and he is recovering, but they did say he's had some life-altering injuries. But it's all stemming from that book.
Yeah.
He wrote a book, and I looked that up just to kind of get a sense of, it's one of those books that I have intended to read and I have not yet. And so I'm like, okay, what exactly is this book? And this is just from the Amazon page describing the book. And it just says, one of the most controversial and acclaimed novels ever written, The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, is his best known and most galvanizing work. Set in a modern world filled with both mayhem and miracles, the story begins with a bang. The terrorist bombing of a London-bound jet in mid-flight. 2 Indian actors of opposing sensibilities fall to earth, transformed into living symbols of what is angelic and evil. This is just the initial act in a magnificent odyssey that seamlessly merges the actual with the imagined, a book whose importance is eclipsed only by its quality. And so he basically was leaning in, from his perspective, examining those roles of good and evil, which almost every book that we pick up is going to touch on that kind of a theme.
Yeah, you're telling us about it, and I immediately thought of Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett.
Oh, I love that book. So good.
And so, he wrote that book. I remember he had to go into hiding because, as you said, a fatwa was issued against him. And I guess there's such a sense of, that was 1988. It's been years. And then 2 weeks ago, he is attacked. Yeah. And so we think it's a small thing to just make sure that people have access to information and points of view and being able to step back and examine our worldview and different thoughts. And it's no small thing. Yeah. And sometimes takes a great deal of courage.
Yeah. Speaking of courage, I think that this is probably going to be the next historical example and the last one that I speak on because it speaks so closely to our job and what the library does. In 2001, the U.S. Patriot Act went into play. So the U.S. Patriot Act was in response to 9/11, and it gave the FBI power to collect information about library borrowings of any U.S. citizen. The act also empowered the federal agency to gain access to library patrons' log-on to internet websites and protected the FBI from disclosing the identities of individuals being investigated. So, when you come to the library and you ask us why we don't have a list of all the books you've checked out, this is a big part of why. We don't keep that information so that if we are subpoenaed, there's nothing to hand over.
People have a right to think their own thoughts.
Yes.
And read their own books and have a expectation of protection.
Yes. And I don't think that, personally, reading a book, any book, I don't care if it's the Anarchist Cookbook, should be enough for you to be hyper-focused in on as a threat. Now, if there is activity that is going along with it, say you're, again, reading the Anarchist Cookbook and you're collecting materials that could be used to create a bomb, okay, now we need to maybe, look into this. But if you're just reading for information...
Well, research is done all the time. And of course, that's used as an excuse. But legitimately, when people are preparing articles, let's say they're talking about the violent altercations that happened in those times of unrest when that book was published. Then, they're going to dig. They're going to research, how realistic was that? How accessible was that? How much was it actually used? And so you're going to stray into areas that you yourself would not necessarily promote.
Sure.
Just as a desire to understand the context of what you're researching.
Sure. And just as somebody who doesn't really write very often, but occasionally does for fun, the amount of times I have Googled, how does this murder work?
Yes.
That's honestly exactly exactly where my brain went is writers. And I know it's like a long-standing joke, but it's like a real thing that, you gotta check your facts.
Yeah, because if you have somebody die,
is vital.
Yes. If you have a character die in your book and it is not a realistic death, people will let you know, especially with the internet.
Yes. Well, I've often, because I just have a randomly curious mind, and I will hear a line or see a movie or something will just make me go, wonder what that would be. And I just Google just a quick, I just want a quick answer to that. And that's it. And that's all. But boy, could somebody get the wrong impression from a search history based on those kind of random thoughts that just make me go, what would that be like? It makes me think of, I feel like I mention this movie all the time because it's a favorite. Rear Window. So he's suspicious of his neighbor, right? And he and his girlfriend are talking about it. And he's looking across and he goes, I wonder what it would take to cut up a human body. Because, of course, they think that's what's happened. Yeah. And his girlfriend looks at him and she goes, you're really starting to scare me. But I feel like that it's a similar kind of situation. You just, this thought goes, how would somebody do a thing like that? Because I think that's what my neighbor has done. What would that mean? What would that take? And people not knowing the context, or even a little bit knowing the context, would still go, what was that?
Yeah. So that brings us into present day book bannings.
All right. So
with the current political climate, we are seeing a lot more challenges and book bannings recently. So we did want to talk about some of those situations, kind of just clear the air of the information we have on those.
So one book banning, and these are really, really recent ones. These are like 2021 to 2022. So Central York School District's use of a diversity reading list to ban books, they didn't use the word ban. They used the word frozen. And these were books that were selected in the wake of the George Floyd death. And books were being added to generate conversation.
Yeah.
To address these difficult issues, things that are happening, where did this come from? What needs to change? How can we grow as a community, as a society? And so this was just a random selection, not random, but a chosen selection of books that address these issues to start these conversations. And rather than banning outright, they froze them, saying, we want to review this list. But they were reviewed for over a year until they were challenged because people were saying, you are basically silencing Black voices.
Yeah. And
they reaffirmed the freezing. But then when they were challenged again, they released them.
Not to get political, but how do you, at any topic,
right?
How do you go into a situation where somebody is trying to educate someone else and say, those tools you're going to use for education, I'm taking those away specifically, and feel like a good person at the end of it?
Well, I mean, the worst enemy we truly have is ignorance. If we are not informed, we cannot make informed decisions. We cannot understand different perspectives if we don't have the information on those perspectives. We cannot put ourselves in someone else's shoes and understand why the mindset they have is the one that they have. We don't have to agree with it, but understanding it will only benefit the conversations that we have and help us to have more productive conversations rather than shouting.
You have a much more wholesome outlook on this than I do.
But no, I feel like taking away teaching tools is so much of what book banning looks like right now. Yes. Like so much of it is, this is in my child's classroom, I don't want it in that classroom. Or even this is in a classroom in a school across the town that I have no affiliation with, but I don't like that. It is a lot of, I don't want to see that being used as a teaching tool. Like so often it's, I don't want that specific thing to be taught.
Yes. And it seems to be very politicized with certain topics currently. And it seems to be going against marginalized groups, specifically people of color and LGBTQIA+. Plus. It is hard to imagine as someone that has lived for the last 30 years in this society that this is not a concentrated effort.
I just remember, I always read books with my children. Like, we would sit around, even when they were older, we would read aloud together just because Mom's a nerd and she loves to read books aloud. And we would come across things that I didn't necessarily agree with. And so I might pause the reading and go, here's where I feel like they're coming from. And here's why I don't agree with that point of view. But it was a conversation. It wasn't, I'm going to skip that chapter. It wasn't, and this is what you will think from here on out. Mm-hmm. It was, here's their perspective. Here's my perspective. Let's talk about this. Ask me questions.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps part of the issue is that we don't have time for that anymore. We don't have time to sit down with our kids and have a deep philosophical discussion as to why two boy penguins can be in love with each other.
Right.
I love that. No, but I feel like we should be able to find the time, because I feel like a lot of families do still read together. And like, I know, like I said, I work with a lot of teens, and one of them was just telling me recently about a book she read and what it kind of taught her about herself and the conversation she was able to have with her parents about that and about her own identity and her parents' identities even and their own past. It's still possible. Like, people have to want to have those conversations. And I feel like that's the hard part, is because all of us have those things that we're like, we don't have time to do X, Y, or Z. But it's really that we don't find that motivation. We don't make that time, because I mean, I am absolutely guilty of being that person who's like, I don't have time to do this thing.
Yes.
And then I look at the screen time on my phone and I'm like, hey, guess how much time I had to do that thing.
Exactly.
Well, and I do think, just respectfully, that we do have a selection bias. Because we work at a library, we are seeing people that care about reading.
Oh, for sure.
So for every example we have of a family that is trying to handle the idea of censored books in a healthy manner, we probably have 2 or 3 families that don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I think that's true. But I just, the time is there for the families who do want it. And
sure.
I think that that's sort of a lot of how the conversation on banned books should be framed, though, is tilting it to learning opportunities and to making conversations versus just, is it right to ban books, which I feel like is a lot of where the conversation is, and is not at the place of conversation and why these books are being banned and what we can learn from those reasons.
Yeah, it makes me think of parents that are trying to help their kids with their math homework where they don't remember how to do that math because it's been so long since they've done it. So rather than being able to help them, they just kind of have to be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But with the idea of book banning, instead of shrugging and saying, I don't know, they're just saying, just don't teach it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't have the words to describe this idea or why I disagree with it, or I don't have the time to do that. So therefore, just don't include it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that also speaks to the fact that, like, I feel like life through your entire life is a learning experience. And I think a lot of people sort of forget that and forget that there are continuous opportunities even into your adult life to learn and grow and have those conversations. And I feel like a lot of people sort of leave that behind instead of kind of noticing that and keeping it going in their lives.
Sure. I think people tend to have an idea when they're like in middle school and high school and college of like what they're going to be when they grow up.
Right.
And then they reach that level and then they have no plans because they didn't plan anything after that. They thought that was the end step. This is just the beginning of a whole new journey.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people that are just kind of living day by day, just making it through life. And so they don't have that time and thought to put into those topics.
All right. So I'm going to talk about another current case. This happened in Ridgeland, Mississippi. A mayor had denied $110,000 in funding to the Madison County Public Library System. And this was funding that had already been approved because they had a selection of LGBTQ books in their collection. And he said, I will not approve this funding until those books are removed. And he cited that he had very strong religious convictions that would not permit him to fund anything that would allow those. The executive director, Tanya Jackson of the library, explained that public libraries are there to serve the entire community, not just specific aspects of it, not one religion over another religion or one political view over another political view, but for the entire community to have access to information. And told him that the collection reflects the diversity of the community. And he said that the library can serve whoever he wanted, but he would only serve the Lord, which I respect everybody's right to their own religious expression. I don't respect the right of restricting other people's freedom to align with your own.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And so basically the library began a fundraiser to raise the money that they had been denied. And they got up to $77,000 in an 8-day period.
Good for them.
So not only were they able to start meeting that challenge, but clearly they had community support for that. And, I get people think differently than I do.
Sure.
I can walk out and find a copy of Mein Kampf in our collection.
Mm-hmm.
I don't condone anything that book promotes. That being said, information is important, especially if you understand the importance of understanding our own history.
Yeah, because if we don't understand history, we're doomed to repeat it, as the saying goes.
Exactly.
Some cliches exist for a reason.
They do. And I have heard it said, and this is probably a little more accurate, it doesn't really repeat, but it sometimes rhymes.
Oh, yeah, I could see that.
And so it's like
that.
the same concepts do get pulled forward if we continue to pretend those things didn't really happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And those people with a living memory go, oh, no, these things happen. But eventually the people with a living memory are no longer there to influence what's going forward. And then you have these people who have no concept of what the context of those issues were and don't realize the outcome that they can have because they've just forgotten they existed.
So yeah, during World War II, when it was wrapping up, Eisenhower specifically stated that we needed to take pictures of the concentration camps and the Holocaust victims because there would be a time period where people denied that it happened, which we are already entering into. There are people
not even entering into. That's been an ongoing issue.
You're correct. Yes. There are people that are still alive that remember going through these situations, these terrible, awful, traumatic situations. And there are other people that are just straight denying that it even happened when we have physical proof. So if you...
Very 1984.
Yeah. So if you expand that idea to book banning and censorship, how much of history have we lost or will we lose that we just don't remember, even though it absolutely happened?
Right.
Well, and we see it through, I call it omission, where it's not really banned, but we don't talk about it.
Yes. That is, I like that you're saying that there's banned outright, we're going to remove this, and then there's just the more subtle version, freezing, omitting, not talking about.
The same thing. We just call it something nice. But I can think of an example, the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yes.
I will state right now, I don't remember ever learning about the Tulsa Race Massacre in school.
I don't think I did either.
Only learned about that when I listened to a podcast, a history podcast that I would regularly listen to. And I was way too old to have never known that event had occurred, but it was never taught to me in school.
More embarrassingly, I didn't know about it until I watched The Watchmen on HBO. In the first episode, they talk about it. That was where I learned about it.
Yes.
I was an adult already. It was too late for me to learn about it.
I had grown children when I learned about it.
So if there is something that happened in our own history that multiple people have never heard anything about because we just don't talk about it, there has to be such a mountain of information that we are missing on top of all this banned material.
Exactly.
And I think it's interesting because I feel like people talk about how, in the future, this isn't going to be the case. You can't just erase things now. But there's so many things that, we see erased every day. And it's not book banning, but the most sort of forward in my head example right now is HBO Max is going through, a merger. And a whole bunch of shows have suddenly disappeared. And even the creators don't have access to them anymore. And it's like those shows never existed. And it's like, is anyone going to have access to those in the future? Are we going to, remember that those exist? It's kind of a silly example, but at the same time, it's like, if that can happen, what else can be wiped from the face of the earth?
No, I think it's a valid point because we talk about book banning because it is Banned Books Week, but information can be taken in multiple forms. Yeah. Including things of that nature. That last, I feel like this would happen, but that last reel of the concentration camps, if someone were to be able to do such a thing, it's easy to remove or hide or destroy information just so people don't know about it.
Sure. And it's not even always antagonistic. Speaking of something that's not as serious as the Holocaust, there's a whole internet corner based or focused around lost media.
Interesting.
And it is so interesting. So there are TV shows or cartoons or commercials or anything that people straight up remember. They have very solid, vivid memories. And it's not just one person, it's multiple people that will remember these things. But nobody can find that media anymore. It's just lost to time. And it makes me think of a movie. So in 1945, there was a movie called Gaslight that came out.
Yeah.
But earlier, before that, there was, I believe, a 1940 version of Gaslight that came out with a whole different cast. And when the rights were bought, the company that bought those rights decided that they didn't want that 1940 version to exist anymore. So they had supposedly all copies destroyed. We've now found out that not all copies were destroyed, but that was an attempt. We're also still missing episodes of Doctor Who.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what the first place my brain went.
So there's just all of this stuff that we're just never going to see again, unfortunately. Yeah. And it's so sad that that is happening on its own, but it's even more sad that there are people out there that are attempting to make it happen for their own reasons.
Right. So clearly Banned Books Week and the concept behind it is very meaningful to all of us. And so I personally have, because this is something I do, if there's something I really like, I will develop my own personal holiday about it. If there's a figure in history that doesn't really have a birthday holiday, but I like them, I'll make a holiday out of that day, you know?
I hope I am one of those people that you make a holiday about.
I could totally see that. There will be knitting and probably a horror movie involved, you know.
Honestly, that sounds like a good time. I'll celebrate it too.
But so Banned Books Week, I have these traditions. I look forward to it all year because it's so important to me. And so what I usually do is I read or perhaps reread a book that was banned or challenged in the past. And I will add a new book to my collection of books that fall under that title. So this year, and I was debating, what am I going to read this year for Banned Books Week, you know? And with the recent attack on Salman Rushdie, I thought, you know what? I have had that book on my shelf with the intention of reading it for quite a while. So that has brought that one to the front. And I'm going to be reading that this year. Banning books actually is awesome for sales. I could not verify this quote, but I saw that Margaret Atwood was quoted as saying, I love banning my books because it's great for sales. But she, speaking of Margaret Atwood, who, of course, is the author of The Handmaid's Tale, I'm going to be adding her book to my collection this year. It's a book I read many, many years ago. I just don't currently have a copy of it in my collection. So that's what I'll be adding this year, just to make sure that it's there.
If you want, we do have a graphic novel depiction of that in the system as well.
Oh.
So if you want something that is a little bit more visual rather than
that would be enjoyable. Since I've read the book, it'd be nice to explore the book again, the story again, but from a different point of view.
Yeah. It's a great book. It's so depressing.
Element. Yeah. Yeah, those are the books I have to brave through. But again, I think it's important. And after I've read something really difficult that I felt like I needed to read, I will often read a very nice, light palate cleanser.
Sure.
You know, it helps me to, keep balance. But I'm not going to walk around with my hands over my eyes. And I'm going to lean in and listen and learn about painful things so that I'm living as a more responsible and informed member of the society I'm in and the society I want to be a part of.
Sure. I don't really have a banned book tradition that I do, but you're inspiring me to do that.
See, that's what I'm here for.
However, I do think I am going to go more towards the end of that conversation where rather than reading a banned book in particular, there's going to be an overlap though. I'm just going to try and find a book that makes me uncomfortable to read.
Oh, well, I can guarantee if it makes you uncomfortable, someone's tried to challenge it.
Exactly. So
good tradition. Good tradition.
I used to be sort of more traditional about it and have like lists of banned books that I would create for myself that I would try to read and stuff when I was younger. And now I really don't do that. Like I try to keep up to date on like lists of what's being banned, especially like most often. But I mostly take solace in the fact that I know that pretty much every book I read is going to be banned by somebody.
That's great.
I read a lot of like young adult fantasy and things like that, and a lot of that includes a lot of LGBTQ representation, and because of that I'm like, somebody out there is trying to ban this, and I just I'm like, I'm just ahead of the banners on this now. And as far though as what I'm reading now that could be banned, I have Genderqueer checked out on Hoopla, which was the most banned book last year according to the American Library Association, and that's one of the reasons I'm trying to read it, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. But soon, maybe I'll wait till Banned Books Week, and that's how I'll celebrate.
You know, I don't know that this one has been challenged, but I could see it.
Mhm.
I'm finally getting around to reading A Discovery of Witches.
Mhm.
And usually anything with that
Yeah.
witchcraft element, like Harry Potter, is going to be challenged or banned
Mhm.
somewhere. So I'm reading it because I want to read it. But like you say, I feel like, see, I'm ahead of my time.
Exactly.
If you'd like another one to add to that list,
Yes.
The Once and Future Witches.
Yes, I've heard of that
Oh,
one.
it's
heard
so
that's
good.
good.
And it is very political,
Yeah.
very feminist. Absolutely going to get banned one day.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So you, I think, had a list of books that are, is it this year's books?
It's
that are
the
being-
2021 most banned books list. Okay, so the American Library Association has a specific department that takes care of kind of compiling a list of the top 10 every year, and you can actually go back and look at like infographics of like reasons that they were banned and things like that. So even though they have a specific department at ALA dedicated to compiling this information, they have done surveys that show that it's possible up to 97% of books challenges and bans are not able to be recorded in this way because they are not reported. So this is really just kind of a very basic kind of look at what is going on as far as book banning goes. And I'm going to try to say these people's last names. Some of them I should have looked up earlier and did not. So the top 10 most challenged books in 2021 are primarily, as Lori mentioned earlier, LGBTQ or written or representing people of color. And they are Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, Lawn Boy by Jonathan Evison, All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl by Jesse Andrews, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson, and then the last one is Beyond Magenta by Susan Kuklin. And yeah, they're primarily LGBT. A lot of them are young adult books as well. Like you mentioned earlier, that's really the demographic that gets hit hardest these days.
Which the ones that kill me a little bit on that list
Mhm.
is The Hate You Give
Yeah.
and The Confessions of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. Those books have been on the ban list for as long as I can remember. I'm pretty
Yes.
sure The Hate You Give was immediately banned when it was published at this point. It's a great book, by the way. I think everybody should read it.
No, if you look at, so ALA's website also has the top 100 most banned books of 2010 to 2019. The top one is The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and I'm sure The Hate You Give is on here. Yes, The Hate You Give is number 30.
That one kills me.
And I don't even think that one was out for most of that time.
No. And I don't understand why it's been banned. I understand to a degree people say that it's because it makes like white students uncomfortable.
Maybe sometimes it's okay to be uncomfortable. Let's just say it.
Yeah, it is. What about all of the people of color that are living or have lived or experienced similar situations? That was surely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I feel like reading about it is the least amount of uncomfortable I can
Right.
sacrifice for that.
And then having to be like, oh, this is a thing that I lived, and then watch other people try to obfuscate it.
Yes.
And ban. Yeah, having your lived experience be one that people are saying is, this is inappropriate for people, we should hide it away, has got to be a special kind of, like, painful. It seems like kind of salt in the wound.
Right. So, in honor of Banned Books Week, at McCullough, which is the branch where I work, we are going to set up a little photo station with like a mugshot kind of framing so that you can come in and choose the book, especially if it's a book that you know has been banned or challenged, but it's not limited to that because, as we say, almost any book's going to get challenged in one way or another. Listen, Winnie the Pooh has been banned.
Yep.
Shel Silverstein has been banned. Where the Wild Things Are has been banned. So almost anything is going to receive a challenge. So even if it hasn't, and you want to stand up with that book, we're going to take your mugshot and put it under the frame of Caught Reading. And that's going to be, that's what's going to be going on at McCullough during the week of Banned Books Week, which again is the 18th through the 24th of September.
And on September 19th out at Red Bank from 4 to 5, we are going to be having sidewalk art for banned books. So you can write down your favorite quotes from a banned book. You can draw a cover from your banned book using chalk on our sidewalks. All right. Well, it has been great talking with everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you have any questions, comments, or if you have a subject that you want us to talk about next time, email us at podcast@evpl.org. But this is us signing off. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.